Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision.
Right. It's like engineering or something.
Exactly. You fall off your bike, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line right across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, yeah, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's a binary state.
It's broken or it's not broken. It's clean, it's visible, and it's neatly categorized. But then you step into the world of complex systems.
Oh, yeah.
You look at something like neurodevelopment or macroeconomics, or in our case today, the structural collapse of entire human civilizations. And suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is honestly incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters because when a complex society is failing, it doesn't usually look like a clean break on an X-ray. In fact, right up until the moment of total collapse, structural failure often looks exactly like success.
Wow. Yeah, it looks like monumental architecture. It looks like record-breaking stock markets or infinite unstoppable growth until suddenly the foundation shatters. And it's just gone.
And that terrifying ambiguity, the idea that a society can be dying while thinking it's at its absolute peak, that is exactly what we're digging into today.
Which is why I'm so excited for this deep dive. Because when human civilizations collapse, there is no simple X-ray. But there are frameworks.
There are. Very precise ones, actually.
Right. So today we're looking at this deeply fascinating set of notes and translations you brought in from a series of lectures by Ghulam Ahmed Parwez, specifically Lecture 11, where he analyzes an ancient text, Surah 26 of the Quran.
Yes, and I want to set the ground rules for you listening right out of the gate. Parwez essentially takes these ancient texts and reads them not as religious fables, but as forensic blueprints.
Blueprints of why societies self-destruct.
Exactly. That is the crucial distinction we have to maintain today. We are entirely discarding the conventional, sentimental, or superstitious readings of these accounts.
Which is so refreshing.
It's necessary. We are not doing theology today. We are putting on our hard hats. We are looking at this strictly through the lens of systems engineering, sociology, and civilizational architecture.
I love that, because normally when people hear about ancient cities collapsing, the story is always, well, they were arrogant, so a magic lightning bolt struck them from the sky.
Right, the supernatural retribution angle.
Yeah. But Parwez strips all of that away, right?
He completely strips it away. He establishes a baseline framework that changes everything about how you read these texts. He introduces this concept of deen.
Okay, let's unpack this deen.
Yeah, so conventionally, you'll see people translate deen simply as religion.
Like a set of private internal beliefs or personal rituals.
Exactly, but Parwez completely rejects that. He argues that deen actually translates to nizam.
Okay, hold on. Nizam. I haven't heard that term used in this context before. Let's slow down for a second. What exactly is a nizam?
A nizam is a comprehensive socio-economic system. It's a structural reality.
Okay.
It encompasses your supply chains, your legal frameworks, your resource distribution, your political hierarchy. It is essentially the operating system of a civilization.
So instead of asking, what do these people believe in their hearts in their private time, the text is actually asking, how is your society engineered?
Yeah.
Like, how does it process resources? How does it handle feedback?
Precisely. Reading these accounts as moral fables trivializes them. They are not fables about angry deities punishing bad manners.
Right.
They are rigorous diagnostic case studies of systemic failure. They provide a framework to understand why human systems fail because of structural flaws in how those societies process reality.
Okay, so I have the notes you pulled from his lecture here, and our primary case study today is the civilizational signature of a society known as the Ad.
Yes, the Ad.
And we're going to examine a specific pathology they suffered from, which Parwez's reading identifies. Let's call it the permanence delusion.
That's a perfect term for it.
Because I want to understand how a society actually engineers its own structural collapse by building systems that systematically ignore feedback.
Well, the Ad are the perfect case study for this because their failure isn't a failure of primitive ignorance. That's a super common misconception about ancient collapsed societies.
Right. We assume they just didn't know enough. They didn't have the tech.
Exactly. But the text explicitly notes that the Ad were highly advanced. They had deep perceptual knowledge, scientific prowess, and insight. The text actually refers to them as being mustabshirin, which implies they had clear sight, they were highly analytical.
They had reached a zenith of civilizational development.
They had.
Which makes their complete collapse all the more terrifying,
Yeah.
right? Like, if they were so smart, so analytical, how did they crash the plane?
That is the million-dollar question.
So I'm looking at the notes from verses 26.128 to 130, and the text focuses entirely on their building habits. Their defining characteristic seems to be monumental construction, building on every high place, constructing massive strongholds.
Yes.
Now, just playing devil's advocate here, building big, impressive stuff just sounds like normal human vanity to me, like every empire does it. Why is Parwez treating this architecture as step one of a systemic collapse rather than just, rich guys showing off?
That is exactly the question we need to ask. The conventional reading looks at these massive buildings and says, look at their luxurious excess, look at their arrogance.
Right. It's a moral judgment.
Exactly. But Parwez reads it structurally. What's fascinating here is that this building program is not merely a display of wealth. It is the physical infrastructure of a cognitive delusion. It is the permanence delusion made of stone.
The permanence delusion made of stone. Okay, what do you mean by that?
So the text states that they build these strongholds thinking they will live forever. The Arabic phrase is la'allakum taqludun.
La'allakum taqludun.
Yes, they pre-commit to immortality.
Wait, they actually think they as individuals are immortal?
The society, the system. They believe their civilization has reached a state of eternal equilibrium. And when a community believes it will endure forever in its current state, it builds its architecture and its social systems accordingly.
That makes sense.
But here is the fatal systemic danger. A community that builds for absolute permanence has simultaneously created the cognitive precondition for its own structural self-destruction.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of that. Why does building for permanence guarantee destruction? Shouldn't building strong, permanent things make you safer?
You would think so, but it comes down to adaptation.
Adaptation, okay.
If you build your society on the fundamental premise that it can never fail, that its current operating model is flawless and eternal, you lose the ability to process evidence of your own dysfunction.
Oh, because acknowledging dysfunction implies impermanence.
Exactly. It implies that something is wrong and needs to change. But if impermanence has been architecturally and cognitively excluded from your system's self-model, you literally cannot perceive the flaws.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see what you're saying. You've essentially disabled the primary mechanism of civilizational adaptation.
Completely disabled it.
Because a healthy, adaptable system needs to be able to look at the data and say, hey, this supply chain isn't working, or our water management is failing. We need to change.
Right.
But the stronghold builder, who has pre-committed to immortality, who operates under that la lakum takludun mindset, cannot do that. You can't course correct if you've permanently glued the steering wheel in place because you assume the road is perfectly straight forever.
That is a brilliant way to put it. You've glued the steering wheel in place, and this isn't just an ancient phenomenon, the ad or a diagnostic template.
It actually feels incredibly modern. Like, it makes me think of the life cycle of a modern tech monopoly.
Oh, absolutely.
You see these companies start in a garage. They're agile. They're constantly adapting. They're paranoid about failing. And because of that adaptability, they reach a massive peak of market dominance.
Right. They win the game.
But then what happens when they become supposedly too big to fail? They don't build flexible, modular workspaces anymore. They build a $5 billion ring-shaped spaceship headquarters. They build a monument.
That is a perfect, precise analogy. The spaceship headquarters is a monument to an assumed eternal dominance. It structurally assumes the market will never change, the technology will never shift, and the company's place at the absolute top of the hierarchy is just, well, a settled law of physics.
But markets do change.
Always.
The underlying reality of the world is constant flux. And when that technological shift inevitably happens, that massive $5 billion spaceship doesn't look like a stronghold anymore. It looks like an anchor.
It's an anchor because all your capital, all your cognitive bandwidth, all your resources are tied up in maintaining the monument rather than navigating the new reality. You see this everywhere in history, and Parwez is pointing out that this text is zeroing in on a universal law of socioeconomic collapse. When a society obsesses over infinite economic growth models that assume resources are endless, they are mirroring this exact delusion.
They're building against the grain of structural reality.
Exactly. The fundamental law of the universe is change. A system that cannot accommodate change is a system waiting to shatter.
So if a society doesn't just wake up one day and decide to build a doomed spaceship, how exactly does a civilization architect this delusion? I mean, it has to be a process, right?
It is a process, yes,
Yeah.
and we can map it.
Well, I'm looking at the linguistic breakdown Parwez does of verses 26.128 to 130. He does this rigorous three-part dissection of the specific blueprints the ad left behind. And he claims this reveals the socioeconomic reality hidden right beneath the words.
Yes, this three-part architectural critique is brilliant because it maps the exact progression of the disease.
Okay, let's go through it.
Let's look at the first step. The text asks, do you build on every high place a monument for amusement? The Arabic phrase here is atabduna bikuli ribbon ayatan tabathun.
Okay.
Let's focus on that last part. Ayatan tabathun.
Ayatan tabathun. How does Parwez translate that in the systems context?
It translates to a monument built pointlessly, carelessly as a sport.
As a sport.
Yes, it's an architectural flex.
So it's not a hospital, it's not a functional bridge, it's not an aqueduct.
No. It has absolutely zero utility for the survival, adaptation, or flourishing of the human beings in that society.
Yeah.
What we are seeing here in step one is the massive misdirection of a civilization's productive capacity. The energy, the human labor, the raw materials that should be directed into functional adaptive infrastructure are instead being siphoned off into pure status signals. It is an astronomical societal waste.
Okay, I get that. Step one is wasted productive capacity. You're directing your GDP into vanity projects on the high places so everyone can see them. But eventually, people are going to notice that the functional infrastructure is decaying, right? What happens then?
Well, that brings us to step two, which is the solidification of that waste into a cognitive delusion.
Okay.
The text continues, and you take strongholds as if you will live forever. وَتَتَكَتُونَ مَسَانِيُ لَأَلَّا تَقْلِدُونَ.
Right, there's that phrase again.
Yes, but the crucial diagnostic word here is masani.
Masani. What does that imply systemically? Because a stronghold just sounds like a military fort to me.
It goes much deeper than just a military fort. The root of masanis implies deep artificiality.
Oh, artificiality.
Yes, these are highly fortified manufactured permanences. The word suggests something meticulously crafted to be unnatural. These are constructed immortalities built entirely against the grain of structural reality. The society is literally walling itself off from the natural laws of change, decay, and feedback.
So they aren't building these walls to keep out a foreign invading army. They're building walls to keep out reality itself.
Exactly. They are building a physical manifestation of their denial. They have committed so deeply to the vanity projects of step one that they must construct an artificial, fortified bubble, the Masanis, to protect the delusion from the outside world.
Man. So the vanity projects evolve into fortified bubbles. They start believing their own hype, and they physically sequester themselves from the consequences.
Right.
I can see how that inevitably leads to the third step, which, looking at the notes, is where this gets incredibly dark.
The third step is the inescapable result of trying to maintain an artificial system in a highly dynamic real world.
Yeah.
The text concludes the sequence, and when you strike as tyrants. Wa'ida batashtum jabarin.
Now, wait. This is fascinating, because reading this normally, I would just think, okay, the king is a tyrant. He's just a bad, cruel guy. But tyranny just looks like evil leadership to me. How does a tyrant fit into a systems engineering model? Why is being Jabarin, striking tyrannically, the logical third step of architecture?
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, social power in a healthy adaptive system is based on legitimate authority, mutual benefit, and rational feedback.
Right.
But remember, the ad have built an artificial system, the Masani, that goes entirely against structural reality, and reality is constantly trying to collapse this delusion.
Reality always asserts itself. Gravity is pulling on the vanity monuments.
Yeah.
The marginalized workers who actually built the things are starving. The actual productive economy is hollowing out because all the resources went into the strongholds.
Precisely. The system is structurally failing, so to maintain the illusion of permanence, to keep the walls of the stronghold up, the leadership can no longer rely on the consent of the governed or on rational economic output.
Right. You require overwhelming brute force.
You do. The social violence that maintains this architecture isn't a glitch. And it isn't just a personality flaw of the leader, it is a structural requirement. The tyrannical strike is the exorbitant, necessary force required to suppress a reality that is desperately trying to correct the system.
Okay, let me try out an analogy here to make sure I'm really grasping the terrifying scale of this.
Go for it.
Let's say you have an economy that completely stops building functional water treatment plants, affordable housing, agricultural technology. Instead, all the societal capital goes into building solid gold statues of the leadership on top of skyscrapers.
Okay.
That's step one. The Ayat, the monuments for amusement.
Right. Massive misdirection of productive capacity.
Now, eventually, the people on the ground are going to lack clean water, they're going to starve, and they're going to start pointing out that the society is actively failing. But the leadership, sitting up in their Masani, their fortified penthouse, looks at the gold statues and says, what do you mean? Look how shiny it is. We are perfect. We are eternal.
Yes. They are cognitively sealed off.
That's step two, the cognitive foreclosure.
Exactly.
And to stop the starving, reality-based public from tearing down the statues and dismantling the penthouse, the leadership has to hire a brutal, militarized police force. The police aren't there for public safety. They aren't there to build anything. They're there strictly to guard the delusion.
Wow.
That's step three, striking as tyrants.
That is an exact socioeconomic mapping of the ad. It perfectly traces Parwez's arc. It moves from wasted productive capacity, solidifies into cognitive delusion, and necessitates extreme social violence to maintain the lie.
Tyranny is just the tax you pay for the lie.
Tyranny is the exorbitant tax a society pays to maintain a structural falsehood.
Which has to be an incredibly expensive way to run a society. I mean, you are burning through your resources just to suppress reality. So you have this massive, forceful, artificial system. It's bankrupting itself to pay the militarized guards of its own delusion.
Right.
What happens when a society like that is finally handed the balance sheet? Because according to your notes, that's exactly what happens next. An auditor arrives to point out the structural flaws.
Yes. And this brings us to a figure named HUD. Now, again, we must rigorously strip away the conventional religious sentimentality here.
No preachers today.
Exactly. HUD is typically portrayed as a priest standing on a soapbox threatening people with supernatural lightning if they don't pray. But in the context of Nizam, in a structural socioeconomic system, HUD plays a very specific technical role. HUD is the system auditor.
He's the guy holding the clipboard. He's the forensic accountant looking at the structural integrity of the aid's entire operation.
Exactly. He is the messenger of reason, attempting to bring empirical external feedback into a system that has closed its loop.
Let's look at how he actually conducts this audit. Because looking at verses 26.132 to 135, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
He doesn't point to the sky. He doesn't make mystical threats. He points directly to the ground.
Yes. He asks them to look at tangible empirical data. He says, look at the livestock, the suns, the gardens, the springs.
The springs and the livestock. Why focus on that? I mean, why not talk about their souls?
Because that is the actual lifeblood of their agricultural and economic system. He is pointing to the foundation of their real survival. He's saying, look at your topsoil degradation, look at your water tables, look at your human capital.
Right.
He's highlighting the functional infrastructure that is being entirely neglected in favor of the Masanis, the artificial strongholds.
It's literally like looking at a modern tech company that is completely obsessed with its new multi-billion-dollar campus, and the auditor walks in, ignores the campus, and says, let's look at your daily active users, your server maintenance costs, and your actual revenue streams. You are bleeding out.
Exactly. HUD is bypassing the delusion and examining the mechanics. And based on that data, he delivers his audit report in verse 135. I fear for you the punishment of a great day.
So in systems language, he's essentially saying, your agricultural base is eroding, your human capital is being wasted, your water sources are mismanaged, the math doesn't work, you are structurally insolvent, and a total market crash is mathematically imminent.
That is precisely the warning.
So how does a society deeply entrenched in the permanence delusion respond to a devastating empirical audit like that?
Well, their refusal is documented in verses 26.136 to 138, and Parwez points out that it is an absolute masterclass in epistemological closure.
Wait, epistemological closure, that's a heavy academic term. Let's break that down for you listening. You mean they literally lost the ability to process new information? Like putting your fingers in your ears, but on a societal scale.
Precisely. Epistemology is how we know what we know. Epistemological closure means the system has rewritten its own code so that external data cannot even be recognized as valid information.
Wow.
Let's look at their exact response to HUD. They say, it is equal to us whether you advise or are not among the advisors. This is only the custom of the ancients, Adatua Awalina, and we will not be punished.
Wow. There is so much layered arrogance in that one sentence. Parwez breaks this down into three distinct defensive mechanisms, right? Let's pull them apart.
Let's do it. The first component is the most direct. The feedback mechanism is explicitly deactivated. They say it is equal to us whether you advise or not.
They are literally telling the auditor that his data input has been routed straight to the void. We don't care what the dials on the dashboard say. We aren't looking at the dashboard.
Exactly. The system is no longer accepting external diagnostic data. It has closed the loop. Now, look at the second component, which is how they dismiss the critique itself. They call his audit the custom of the ancients, or adatu al-awwalina.
Why use that specific phrase, custom of the ancients? It sounds like they're calling him old-fashioned.
They're doing something very insidious here. They aren't evaluating his empirical argument about the livestock and the springs. They aren't saying, actually, HUD, our water tables are fine, here's our data. Instead, they are miscategorizing his analytical critique as mere tradition without content. They are classifying the very concept of an audit as a primitive cultural mode that they have evolved past.
Oh, that is wild. It's an ad hominem attack on the concept of accountability itself. They dismiss the format of the message so they don't have to engage with the substance.
Exactly. And that leads perfectly into the third component, which is the boldest, most irrational claim of all. We will not be punished. Which, in our secular systems language, translates to, our system will not fail.
And let me guess, their evidence for this invulnerability is exactly zero.
They have zero empirical evidence. Their assertion that they will not fail relies entirely on their foundational assumption of permanence. They cannot accept that their architecture will fail simply because the architecture was built on the premise that it wouldn't.
It's the ultimate circular logic. Our system is flawless because we designed it to be flawless. Therefore, your empirical data showing flaws is conceptually impossible and logically irrelevant.
Yes. Think back to your CEO analogy.
Right. It's like a CEO being handed a devastating financial audit showing the company is bleeding cash and is weeks away from insolvency. The CEO takes the audit, throws it in the trash, and says, look, financial audits are just a 1990s cultural tradition. We are a post-revenue visionary company. We don't do those here. Furthermore, our company logo is etched in titanium on a $5 billion building, so bankruptcy is physically impossible.
And that CEO would be demonstrating the exact cognitive pathology of the ad. When you use your own self-generated branding, your monuments, as proof of your operational viability, you are already dead. You just haven't hit the ground yet.
You're just a cartoon character walking off a cliff who hasn't looked down.
Exactly. The ad cannot see the impending collapse because the warning signal is incompatible with their civilizational operating system. They have engineered a reality where they cannot fail, right up until the second they are destroyed.
Which naturally brings us to the actual mechanics of the destruction. When a society entirely unplugs its feedback mechanisms, ignores the eroding foundation, and relies on circular logic to justify immense resource waste, what is the socioeconomic physics of the fallout? How does the crash actually happen?
Well, this brings us to a fascinating core concept in Parwez's framework, the law of requital.
Yes, mukafat amal. The law of requital is perhaps the most crucial concept for understanding this entire text as a systems engineering document rather than a religious one.
It really is. It is essentially the universal law of cause and effect applied directly to human action and societal structures. It is, for all intents and purposes, a law of civilizational thermodynamics.
Civilizational thermodynamics. I love that phrasing.
Yeah.
Okay, thermodynamics involves the transfer of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. Let's unpack this. How does Mukafar Amal apply specifically to the ad's failure mode? Because Parwez argues their dysfunction wasn't just passive ignorance.
No.
They didn't just accidentally sleep through the warning alarms.
No, it was an active, highly energetic misdirection of their resource base. Think about it in terms of thermodynamics and energy expenditure. Every monument built for amusement, every Ayatan Tabathan, was a massive unit of energy, human labor, and raw resources actively denied to productive, life-sustaining infrastructure.
Right. Every multi-ton stone lifted to the top of a mountain for a vanity project was a stone not used to fortify the agricultural reservoir.
Exactly.
Every hour of labor spent polishing a golden statue was an hour not spent innovating agricultural techniques. The energy was transferred away from survival and into the delusion.
Precisely. And every stronghold, every Masani, was a vast amount of social and material capital dedicated to a structurally false reality. But it goes even deeper than bad budgeting. Think about the third step, the tyranny.
The Jabberin.
Yes. Every act of tyrannical force the Jabbering strikes used to suppress the starving workers or silence the auditors like HUD was social capital burned for self-preservation rather than genuine production.
So wait, does this mean that tyranny isn't just morally reprehensible, but that it's functionally, mathematically inefficient?
Yes.
Like the very act of suppressing the truth physically bankrupts the system.
That is exactly what Parwez's reading suggests. Oppression is incredibly resource-intensive. When a society has to spend 90% of its GDP, its cognitive focus, and its state security apparatus simply maintaining an illusion and suppressing internal dissent, it only has 10% of its energy left for actual survival, adaptation, and innovation.
Wow. You are starving the functional organs of the civilization to feed a tumor of permanence.
That is exactly it. And eventually, the host dies. The math catches up.
The math always catches up. The catastrophe that eventually wipes out the ad is not supernatural retribution. It isn't a magical storm conjured out of nowhere by an angry deity to punish them for being haughty.
No, it is a mathematical certainty. It is the structural collapse of a system that spent all its adaptive capacity maintaining a myth.
So when the inevitable environmental stressor arrives, whether that's a drought, a famine, a shift in trade routes, or an economic shock, the system shatters because it has zero resilience.
None.
It spent all its resilience building the Masanis.
The law of requital simply states that a system built on false inputs, a system that actively denies the structural reality of the universe, will inevitably produce a catastrophic output. You cannot cheat the socioeconomic physics of the universe.
Man, this particular structural collapse is utterly fascinating. I could dissect the ad all day. But to truly understand the significance of this diagnosis within the text, Parwez insists we have to zoom out. We can't just look at the ad in isolation. We have to look at the broader data set across lectures 8, 9, 10, and 11, specifically looking at the arc of Surah 26.
Yes.
Because the ad are not the only case study presented, are they?
No, they are not. Surah 26 is brilliant because it presents comparative analysis of systemic failure. It doesn't just show one way to crash a society. It catalogs distinct, varied civilizational pathologies. If we compare the ad to two other major case studies presented in the source material, the Society of Noah and the Society of Moses and Pharaoh, we see a comprehensive taxonomy of self-destruction.
Okay, let's synthesize this. Let's look at Noah's society first. According to Parwez's structural reading, what was their specific pathology? How did they fail to process the audit?
In Noah's society, the rejection of the feedback mechanism was primarily class-based. Noah, acting as the system auditor, brought a message of structural reform, specifically advocating for equality and the dismantling of predatory, entrenched economic hierarchies. But the elites of his society rejected the audit.
Why?
And they didn't reject it necessarily because the data was factually wrong, but because of the socioeconomic status of Noah's followers.
Oh. They looked at who was delivering the message.
Exactly. They looked at the laborers, the working class, the marginalized who were supporting the systemic reform, and essentially said, we are the elite. We cannot possibly accept a system redesign that elevates these commoners to our level or requires us to listen to them.
Right.
Their pathology was a social filtration of honest evaluation. The truth was blocked by class prejudice.
Okay, so Noah's society crashed the plane because they ignored the warning lights on the dashboard, simply because they looked down on the mechanic who installed them. I'm a pilot, I don't listen to grease monkeys, and then they fly into a mountain.
Very apt analogy.
Okay, what about the case study of Moses and Pharaoh? That's a very famous dynamic. How does that fit into this taxonomy of failure?
That is a different mechanism entirely. In the Moses case study, the pathology is explicit, calculated political suppression by an absolute authority. Moses presents undeniable empirical evidence of the system's brutality and unsustainability. He shows them exactly how their slave-based economy and rigid hierarchy is courting disaster. But Pharaoh, representing the apex of an entrenched political power structure, actively suppresses that evidence.
He doesn't just ignore it.
No, he combats it. He uses the entire apparatus of the state, the media of the day represented by the magicians, the military force, to obfuscate the truth, to run counter-narratives, and to maintain the political hierarchy at all costs. The feedback is recognized by the leadership, but it is politically censored and violently combated to protect the regime.
So, using our plane analogy, Moses' society put duct tape over the warning lights because the captain explicitly ordered it. The captain knew the plane was going down, but maintaining his absolute authority in the cockpit was more important to him than saving the passengers.
That's a grim but incredibly accurate way to look at it. Which brings us back to our deep dive today, the ad. Their pathology is fundamentally different from the social prejudice of Noah's time, or the calculated political censorship of Pharaoh's regime. The ad's pathology is entirely cognitive.
Right. They committed to the architecture of permanence so deeply that structural self-assessment became cognitively inaccessible.
Exactly. They didn't ignore the warning lights because of class, and they didn't put duct tape over the warning lights to protect a dictator. They custom-built a civilizational plane without a dashboard entirely.
They engineered a cockpit where warning lights physically could not be installed because their foundational architectural design principle was this plane cannot crash.
That is the ultimate cognitive foreclosure. They built a civilizational infrastructure that made the corrective signal structurally undetectable from within the system. They were trapped inside the Masani of their own minds.
Unbelievable.
So, across this text, we have three distinct routes to the same structural endpoint: social filtration, political suppression, and cognitive foreclosure. But they all lead to the exact same outcome dictated by the law of requital. They all lead to a system that cannot process the evidence of its own dysfunction until the dysfunction becomes terminal and irrecoverable.
And Parwez points out that there is a repeating refrain across all these stories in Surah 26. After each civilization collapses, the text says that is a sign, but most of them were not mu'minin.
Yes.
Now, in a conventional reading, mu'minin is usually translated as believers in a strictly religious sense. But in this systemic context, Parwez completely redefines what mu'minin means, doesn't he?
He does, and it's a vital redefinition. In this structural framework, mu'minin does not refer to sentimental believers who just blindly accept dogma. It refers to individuals who are aligned with reality.
Aligned with reality.
Yes. It refers to people who trust in a rational, feedback-responsive system, the actual nizam of the universe, rather than a manufactured, artificial delusion.
So a mu'min is the exact opposite of someone living in the permanence delusion.
Precisely. A mu'min is someone who recognizes the law of requital. Someone who understands that actions have immutable structural consequences, and who builds for adaptation and human benefit, what the text calls mayanfal anas, rather than for vanity and forced permanence.
They're the ones who accept the audit. They're the ones who look at the data, look at the eroding topsoil, look at the failing supply chains and say, we need to change course. We need to adapt.
Yes. The tragedy of Libya is that they thought their massive strongholds made them safe, when in reality, those very strongholds were the architects of their doom. By sealing themselves off from the vulnerability of change, they guaranteed their own destruction.
Which is such a profound, heavy realization. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it makes me want to turn to you, the listener. I want you to reflect on your own environments right now. Think about the companies you work for, the institutions you're a part of, the political systems you live under, maybe even your personal lives or your own belief systems.
It's completely applicable on every scale.
It is. Where are you building monuments for amusement instead of functional, adaptive infrastructure? Where are you pouring massive amounts of energy into projecting an image of invulnerability rather than doing the hard, vulnerable work of adapting to reality?
Those are exactly the diagnostic questions Parwez's framework demands we ask.
Are you treating vital, critical feedback from the people around you, from the auditors in your life, as an irrelevant custom of the ancients? Are you assuming that because you are successful today, because your company's logo is etched in titanium, that you are immune to the law of requital tomorrow?
We all need to be asking those questions, because this text isn't just an archaeological history of dead cities, it's a mirror. And if we connect this ancient framework to the bigger picture of our world today, it leaves us with a rather chilling final thought to mull over.
What's that?
Well, we look back at the literal stone monuments of the Ad, the ziggurats, the ancient strongholds, the high places, and we can easily recognize their permanence delusion. We easily see the hubris in thinking a stone wall could stop time and prevent change.
All right, it's so easy to judge them in hindsight. We think, how could they be so blind?
But look at what we are doing today. Look at our highest civilizational priorities right now.
Okay.
We are frantically uploading our entire civilizational consciousness to the cloud. We're obsessing over eternal digital data retention, saving every mundane thought forever in massive data centers. We are pouring billions into artificial intelligence that promises to mimic human thought eternally. We have tech billionaires searching for literal biological immortality.
Oh, wow.
We are constructing infinite virtual realities to escape the physical decay and the environmental feedback of our actual planet. This raises an incredibly important question. are we simply building the invisible digital equivalent of the ad's stronghold?
Our server farms are Masani. Are we building digital fortresses against reality?
Have we mistaken infinite data storage for actual civilizational adaptability? Because if a society that thinks it will live forever loses the ability to adapt to the present moment, then our pursuit of digital immortality might just be the most spectacular permanence delusion in human history.
We might be building the most advanced diagnostic X-ray machine ever conceived, only to use it to take pictures of our vanity monuments while completely ignoring the massive systemic fractures it's showing us in our actual foundation right now.
That is a staggering thought, and an absolutely perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Parwez's structural reading of the ad. Until next time, keep questioning the architecture around you, keep looking at the dashboard, and whatever you do, don't glue the steering wheel in place.